My name is Edward Clayton. I am the Chief Financial Officer for both Burns Lake Native Development Corporation and Burns Lake Native Logging Limited.
And I'm John Nooski. I'm the Small Business Development Officer for Burns Lake Native Development Corporation.
This is lake country. You can't go over a hill without there being another lake.
Lots of recreational opportunities.
Yes.
Fishing?
Yes.
Yeah, fishing. And in the winter, ice fishing, snowmobiling, things like that.
Yeah, it is the good life around here. But it is. They have a very well developed trail system locally, and me and my family take advantage of that all the time. And amongst ourselves, we call this the Little Gem in central BC. Yeah, it hasn't got out yet, but once it does, and people start realizing how great this area is, yeah. Our organization started back in 1974. Our mandate was employment and training, and it still is today, and from that 4 objectives. But other than that, we're owned by the 6 local First Nations that comprise our area here in Burns Lake, and each of the directors are seated at our table, and in their own roles, they're chiefs of their own nations. Yeah, so that's how we came to be. I myself started here in January of 2017, so I'm a short timer here, very much so. But if you talk to John here next to me, he's been here a lot longer than I have.
Yeah, I started in September 2006, so I've been here a bit longer, and it's sort of evolved since then.
The development corporation itself, basically we have a lending function, we have a business development function, all within the mandate of employment and training, creating employment training for First Nations people. Now that may seem self-serving, but there's not a lot of organizations that are First Nations that are serving primarily First Nations with those objectives. Mm-hmm. So.
Well, we've sort of tried to nurture a lot of the First Nations entrepreneurs from our 6 First Nations who are our priority, and local First Nations living in the Lakes District who may not be a member of the 6 First Nations. And a lot was in the resource industry, like in logging, especially logging trucks. And some of them are still in existence right now. Some have retired or moved on to work for others. We try to get them on our crew to run their own trucking industry. Yep. Or else other things to work for us, and other small businesses where people have started gas bars on their reserve, and small catering companies, things like that. We're still trying to nurture those and get the newer generation out with different businesses, and the majority of the funding we have left is just for the forest industry, like our.
I think it's all how they start, or how they how they start their race, as it were, and how they get out of the gate. We know that First Nations like collaboration, they like consultation, they like to be part of things and to know what's going on. And I think if you tackle that at the front end, rather than wait for misconceptions to happen, that you can alleviate or mitigate or avoid completely all of that misconception that comes with resource development in Canada. Yeah. And so I think on that note, I would say that as long as they're following that sort of protocol with respect to consultation of First Nations, that resource development can happen anywhere in Canada with respect to an oil pipeline. The better education you have, the better you're able to grasp these concepts in terms of what is actually going on with regard to the resource development that's going on the ground. And I think you need that understanding. And in order to develop that world picture as to where this resource development fits in, who are you supplying, why are they doing it, sort of thing like that. What do they need out of it? Better question from an ECDAP perspective that we all should be asking. Do they need suppliers? Do they need workers? Those sort of things like that. Mm-hmm. And that's the big question in Native country all the time, is how do we prepare ourselves for this development? Do we want this sort of development? That's always the big question. And you're always going to find that the hereditary chiefs of any nation, they don't want the land to be compromised, because we have I don't want to say a separate, but we have definitely a different idea of the value of the land than, say, an oil company would. For us, it's provides sustenance, provides shelter, provides all these wonderful things that we lived off the land for millennia in BC. And I think that's where they're coming from, is they don't want that to be interrupted. So when you're consulting with First Nations, if you can address those issues in terms of, yes, they'll still be able to sustain themselves. Yes, they'll still be able to get shelter off the land, sort of thing like that. I think if you address those issues in a comprehensive fashion, you would probably, your development would happen a lot easier. It could be a hindrance, that sort of viewpoint that we're still focused on a traditional way of life in terms of people's understanding about First Nations and where we're coming from. But I think it also makes them think that we're inferior in some way, intellectually or something, because of these notions that we have about living off the land and everything like that. But when you look at where we're coming from, over 10,000 years in some cases. I can't remember what the longest one was. I think it was 25,000 years or something that we just seen. They found archaeological evidence of that First Nation being there. And it just makes you think that, well, we've been here and doing this a lot longer than when the Europeans came to our country and developed it, sort of thing like that. And I guess all I'm trying to say is that, yeah, I can see where they're coming from, but it also acts as a hindrance, sort of thing like that. Because, when you look at today's world and where things come from, 9 out of 10 times it's going to come from something that was manufactured, something that somebody else built and that we bought in this area, sort of thing like that. China, you can't buy anything and turn it over without seeing made in China. Yeah. Yes, that's pretty much the reality today, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
They each have their own cultural components and their aims, and language retention is the main one, I think. And it's like you said, it's you can't retain a culture without the language. You just can't. And I agree with that completely. And you'll see a lot of that in our local six First Nations in terms of retaining that language, whether it be through programs, language programs where they offer to the younger people, Native people. That's usually how we see that come down in terms of those kind of forms. Hey, John?
Yeah, and Lake Babi Nation being the biggest nation, they have the most resources in their own schools, and that's part of their curriculum on their reserve school there.
Yeah, right.
There's also something called traditional ecological knowledge, tech they call it, and that's a big word around here. And basically what we're saying is that, if you put this traditional ecological knowledge in terms of valuing just the resources around you, that makes such a big difference, in terms of how people view that resource, sort of thing. And that's the implication of that. So it'd be interesting once they see that, because then you'd see a whole new value system in terms of what's valued in a forest, right?
I think they're flowing with it. Some of them are smart enough to realize that if they spend the time and energy to go through with that, then they'll have more success with that First Nation and the next First Nation down the line. So that's a pretty smart move on their part.
Yeah, partnering with corporations, that's definitely, they're seeing the value in First Nations partnerships in terms of what First Nations can offer. That, First Nations, once they get past their differences in terms of how development's going to happen, they could be good partners financially, as far as manpower goes, and as far as developing the resources. So they could be good partners, and I think that you're seeing that buy-in from the First Nations, because they're starting to realize the benefits of those partnerships, and that they're realizing the benefit of not just having a relationship with that company, but developing that relationship into a formal partnership.